Welcome back to Retro Rebound. In today's video, we are going back to quite the unlikely one, Freedom Wars. So today arrives Freedom Wars Remastered. And the question you may be asking, as someone who maybe didn't own the lovely little handheld that always could, the PS Vita, is this game really that good? This was actually one of the most important PlayStation Vita exclusives. I'm gonna get into why to open things up. For starters, this was one of the last bastions of hope for the PS Vita community. It was always said, and I never really quite understood why, that PS Vita needed its own massive Monster Hunter IP. And to PlayStation's credit, as well as their partners, they threw a lot of stuff at the wall. Everything from Soul Sacrifice all the way up to Freedom Wars. They were trying to find their pocket in that Monster Hunter genre. It's because Monster Hunter 3 Ultimate on 3DS was really taking over, and there was a large belief across the industry at the time that they needed a Monster Hunter clone to compete to then sell units of the PS Vita. It had nothing to do with the memory card or the price of it all or the lacking use of like 3G features. It was because they needed one of these. But anyway, there was a lot of hopes placed on this because with every major Vita exclusive, the life on the system faded away more and more. You could tell PlayStation was clearly pulling away from this lovely little handheld, and more people wanted to succeed, but it just didn't seem like it was going to get that support. However, Japan really kept the Vita afloat, and this was about to be a massive game in Japan. The question was, could it make the trip overseas and justify further support for the Vita? Because remember, it was like this cult classic handheld system, because every little victory would move that finish line a couple months down the road, but we needed a big one. And Freedom Wars was the one that people were really hoping would deliver. This was after Killzone Mercenary. Pretty much all of PlayStation's first party was really shot. So it was all on the back of Freedom Wars. And I thought it was great. It wasn't a system saver, but it was another great game in an otherwise phenomenal catalog. Again, I distinctly remember the zeitgeist was PlayStation needs one of these, but the problem really was development costs were going up, and you may as well, with the money you were spending to make a Vita game, which wouldn't sell as much, go and make a console game. And so people were making stuff for the PS4 instead, where it was selling like hotcakes versus the Vita, which wasn't selling as much. So you get why things played out the way they did, but this was one of the most important PS Vita exclusives. So imagine my surprise when this lovely little game ends up getting remastered. The rights go over to Bandai, and Bandai, if this does succeed, ends up being able to make another Freedom Wars game. That is unbelievable to me. So since I don't have a PS Vita TV, I couldn't put a Vita game like Freedom Wars on the CRT. So we're gonna have to settle for Tearaway, which is another phenomenal PS Vita game that randomly got ported off of the Vita onto the PS4. But also, this is kind of a sad day because each time the Vita loses another core exclusive like this, it does put the handheld in its coffin a little bit deeper. And Freedom Wars to me was one of the best reasons to still pick up a Vita. You know, for me, it used to be Danganronpa. Then that even got ported. So many games that were unlikely to get ported ended up getting picked up and moved over. So with that giant intro out of the way, let's talk about Freedom Wars, because this is an important game and you should be looking into it if you're into Monster Hunter style games, dystopian worlds, sci-fi games, you like really crazy storylines, you like different combat systems in these Monster Hunter style games, you're gonna find that here. So we're gonna break it all down. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're new here and you're into nostalgic or retrospective content, consider subscribing. So first off, what does Freedom Wars Remastered come with? Well, of course, improved frame rates, of course, improved visuals, but you're not gonna get an overhauled gameplay experience. So as we saw in the previews leading up to launch, if you were looking at Freedom Wars Remastered as like, oh, I found it a little bit janky on PlayStation Vita, and I'm thinking it's gonna be smoothed out here, and they're gonna do some changes to the controls. That's not happening here. But the benefit of playing it on a full-fledged DualSense versus playing it on the Vita is longer analog sticks, better sense of player control, because what happens when you're playing a game like Freedom Wars is you have this system called the Thorns, and think of it like you're web zipping your way to your enemies, right? Like you're attaching them to objects and you're pulling yourself to them. That's what you're doing here. And so you'll be able to attach to like an enemy's arm and zip through and cut that bad boy off. And it's like a Monster Hunter game in that you have these big creatures that you're just working away on, time in, time out, over and over until finally a big piece of them falls off and you collect that for some loot. What's different about this game is that it's a lot of guns. So the main loot in this game is like assault rifles and shotguns and all these crazy weapons on top of a giant blade that you get to use with the thorns, and your thorns can have different effects as well. So it's a really unique Monster Hunter style game in my opinion in that way. I will not act like I'm a complete expert on the genre, but it held my attention longer than a lot of Monster Hunter games because of the world. What makes Freedom Wars so interesting is it's all set in a dystopian world. For those who don't know, you're under surveillance with 1,000,000 years on your prison sentence, and you're gonna go out and kill these various creatures and machines and complete all of these missions to whittle away your prison sentence. And each mission will offer its different suite of rewards, but you'll see like one of the mission rewards will always be the amount of years off your sentence. And it feels really good to get it lower and lower. And I remember when this game came out on the Vita, and it's cool to be able to re-experience it again, is like there's this rush on the leaderboards that like everyone's countries are trying to get their stats the lowest, like who's the most free. That was the coolest part. It was like this insurmountable height, like 1,000,000 years on a prison sentence, like how much grind you have to do to get over that. But I loved it because it gave me a narrative purpose. Like if you really bite into this world and what it's offering for you, it gives you a narrative purpose to really get into the whole monster hunting part of things. Like for me, I struggled with that. Like I tried games like Monster Hunter 3 Ultimate on DS and I didn't like it. Why is that? I didn't like it because my hands cramped. I was like, this doesn't feel good to play. I thought Freedom Wars though felt good to play. And on top of that, it had like this cool world where I was like, this is so messed up, man. And they actually got into this pretty extensively because the actual director of the game is now a producer on the remaster. His name is Takashi Tsukamoto, and he actually said that the Freedom Wars story was inspired by what was going on in Japan 10 years ago, where they said, quote, when the original version came out 10 years ago, there was a thing called My Number in Japan, similar to US with social security numbers. This was a very new concept in Japan 10 years ago. Citizens of Japan didn't have a social security equivalent, and since it was a brand new idea coming up, there were a lot of people who were against it, like don't put a number on us. I guess living in a first world country like Japan, they always have your information on hand, you're on file. It's kind of like you're being in constant surveillance. When you're walking around the city, there's cameras everywhere. There's a little bit of a parallel between that in this game. Obviously, we're not in a prison, but the idea of being in constant surveillance and people having our information was a very strong concept we wanted to work with when creating this game. In the game, these people are prisoners with million-year sentences. It's not a one-to-one, obviously. I mean, I hope I'm not a prisoner. So again, if you really need that kind of world space to bite onto to make the monster hunting interesting, I think you'll find that here. But I don't want to sell the gameplay mechanics short, because what really makes Freedom Wars stand out is that thorn system, right? Like attaching to a machine, pulling yourself in. That flow is really good. The thing I would say I'm worried about with a Freedom Wars remaster that I think a lot, not all, but a lot of these PS Vita exclusive games do struggle with is the transition to console and sort of the intangible that comes with. My favorite example of this is actually Final Fantasy Type 0 HD. I remember when that came over to the West, I was so excited, and I do absolutely adore that game. I remember like crying at the end, like I think it's so good. However, it was clearly a game built with the PSP in mind. Games nowadays aren't really designed that way, but during the handheld era, there were games that were made with the idea of like, hey, you're gonna put this down eventually, where nowadays games never really want to let go of you. So a game like Final Fantasy Type 0 would have an arena mode that you would leave your characters in, and while your Vita was in sleep mode, these characters would be leveling up. So there's a way to grind while you were away from the game. It's also, hint, hint, nudge, nudge, a really easy way to get the Platinum Trophy, but I digress. This is a game in Freedom Wars where long sessions don't really always favor it, because you do get into that rhythm and that routine, and you don't really change how you fight enemies. You're always going to be throwing out your thorn, dashing at them, cutting off those limbs, hammering away, shooting away, and rinse and repeat. Even on some of the higher level missions, some of the higher level operations, this is going to be your rhythm. And it kind of feels worse when you're fighting against like human enemies and you're in these like cube-like environments, these hallways and stuff, where it turns more into a third-person shooter. It's there. I also think the game might lose some of its luster, which is a shame, but that is just my personal opinion as someone who's played a lot of Freedom Wars, is that this game is great. It's phenomenal in bursts. Like for me, whenever I was done working out or I was getting home from school, firing up Freedom Wars for like an hour and a half, 2 hours, grinding a little bit, and then getting to some homework or whatever. Like, that is what I remember so clearly about my time with Freedom Wars. Easy to pick up and put down, and it worked really well on the PS Vita. So I do wonder if in a console environment, this is going to end up being problematic for people because it is designed to be pick up and play. They do have a decent amount of mission variety in Freedom Wars. Like, for example, there are hostage rescues, or there's wave-based modes where you'll like fight against tons and tons of enemies at once, and like that can be overwhelming. It's also a really great kind of co-op romp, so if you're looking to go through the game with a friend, this is a good one to pick up alongside them. But it's really just a shock and awe to me that this really exists at all. It's going to come with its little bit of repetition. It's not an incredible story, but they also did invest in one area that was surprising to see, and that's a full English voice cast from top to bottom. This game has been dubbed, and I thought that was insane to see. Granted, I mean, it's a little bit of a drop in the bucket for a company like Bandai to get the rights to this game. The game's already made. They're like, okay, upscale this sucker and put it on consoles. Let's see how many people are willing to buy it. And I do wonder if people will buy this at all, because it's going to be a sign to a lot of developers, and particularly Sony, I think they're going to be watching this wondering, hey, will people actually buy these Vita ports? Because when you look at the Vita collection, there are so many games that are still stuck there. I think of like Army, Cores of Hell. Square Enix has that one. Do they want to port that over? It kind of reminds me of Overlord. Does Sony want to bring over Killzone Mercenary? This is a really great Killzone game that's super addicting. Granted, I think it functions best in bursts, but it's definitely an awesome game where you're running around as a mercenary and you are killing enemies, and every kill and objective you complete, everything you do gives you money in that game, and it's like a really addicting progression system. Resistance Burning Skies is pretty mid, but I'd throw that out there. Soul Sacrifice is an amazing dark, like the voice acting in that game's awesome. The combat's really action-packed, but it's definitely another sort of, I would call it, Monster Hunter style game. Will that come over? I do feel like the success of something like a Freedom Wars Remastered might dictate a few more games leaving the platform, because there still are plenty games there. Uncharted Golden Abyss is still there. That was from Ben's studio, and that is one of the longer games in that series. I remember it took me like 15 hours to get through. Like, it was a much longer game, and as someone who loves Uncharted 1, that game reminded me a lot of Uncharted 1, so I was all about it. Unit 13 is still stuck on PS Vita. I apologize. Now we've really opened the can of worms. We've now entered the territory of Maddie just raving and losing his mind about the PS Vita, but I do wonder if a Freedom Wars Remaster can unlock these different opportunities. I'm not fooling myself that a game like Dynasty Warriors Next is going to come over to PS Vita, but I do wonder about these sorts of possibilities, because I think companies are looking for like low risk investments, and hey, a couple of ports bring some Vita games over. Why not? The games are otherwise just sitting there collecting dust. But I am very excited to play some Freedom Wars Remastered, between the English dub, the bump in frame rate, the bump in visuals, and just the idea, like, this is one of those games that I just say to myself, I'm not going to tell other people to do it unless they feel the same way, but it's just a buy to support. I don't have to go out and senselessly grind this game, but the fact that I, as a customer, now have it in my hands to be able to enable a Freedom Wars 2 to exist, I can at least do my part. So I am buying this game absolutely today, no doubt about it. And if you think what you saw looks pretty cool, I think you should as well. Freedom Wars is a really good time for you Monster Hunter fans out there. It's a dystopian world where you're constantly under surveillance and you're fighting against your prison sentence. It's a really cool idea, and there's nothing really quite like it. But again, for my Vita fans out there, you already know this was our last bastion of hope, and now it's back again. It's bigger than ever, so I'm very excited to see the sales charts for this one. But that's all I've got for you here in today's Retro Rebound. Let me know your thoughts on Freedom Wars down below. I'm looking forward to seeing your thoughts. With that, take excellent care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.